Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us. Are you ready for Hamilton, the podcast? I'm Vinton Bain.
And I'm Robbie Herlocker, and today on the podcast, we're talking about Cabinet Battle number 1. Vinton, why don't you start us off by just explaining to us what exactly is a rap battle?
So a rap battle is basically where you have two rappers who meet up and they try to outperform each other. Usually they'll try to put each other down and show their skills off. And there's usually a crowd around them and an MC, a master of ceremonies, who's kind of guiding and officiating the whole thing. In this song, we have Washington performing that role.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And typically they want to not only show that they're better than their opponent, but they want to prove to the crowd that they're the better rapper, that they have the skills, basically.
Yeah, so this is like battle rapping, and it incorporates like moving around the crowd, flipping your opponent's insults against them, proving that you have a better verbal prowess than them. You kind of try to just walk all over them. If you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, like they have a number of these in there because it's Eminem's story where he kind of comes up and he does that.
Yeah, Lin-Manuel Miranda even said that he wrote these inspired by basically 8 Mile and the rap battles in that film.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of Hamilton's really sophisticated rhyming schemes really do model a lot of Eminem's rhymes, and a lot of rappers who did that, like Big Pun in the 90s did some, they were like that, like dead in the middle of little Italy, little did we know that we riddled some middlemen who didn't do diddly. Like that internal rhyming scheme that he has is something that comes up all the time in Hamilton's rap styles. And so to see something that beckons back to 8 Mile is definitely appropriate for a battle with Hamilton in it, but it's also just the tone of a hip-hop musical. You can't go very far without having a rap battle because it's so integral to the culture of rap and hip-hop specifically.
So generally in a rap battle, you're trying to prove that you're better than the other person. But here in this cabinet battle, the stakes are a little higher. Depending on the outcome of this cabinet battle, the whole country could change.
Right, so the stakes are high, and so the decisions that are made in this Washington administration are going to point America towards one future or the other, and Jefferson and Hamilton had a very different direction for where they wanted the country to go.
So this battle kind of brings in the formation of the two parties that the country is going to have for a little bit, the Federalists and then Jefferson's Democratic Republicans.
Right, so the Federalists eventually, like later in the musical, we'll actually see the real forming of the parties as far as Lin-Manuel's placement of it in Act 2. But the Federalists picked their name because it beckons back to what they were calling the supporters of the Constitution. It's almost like this backwards way of saying, hey, if you're not a Federalist, then you probably must not support the Constitution of America. And that's a big deal. So they're trying to put a stab there. And then the Democratic Republicans, or sometimes just called the Republicans, got their name from the Roman Republic, where they basically are kind of implying that their enemies wouldn't be for representative republics, and they're not real, true Republicans. And so the names of the parties at this point in the musical don't really exist yet. They haven't picked their factions specifically, but here we see the cementing of what will be those parties. Like you said, we're going to see that Jefferson is not going to be a fan of the big centralized federal government and the building up of the central government. And Hamilton says, if we don't do this, the entire American experiment is going down the drain. So the stakes are high on both ends of the spectrum.
Hamilton wants to pass a plan where the federal government's going to take on the state debts that were incurred during the war. But Jefferson, and he's representing the whole South here, fears that this will lead to a more centralized government and that the common man won't be heard and won't have a say in legislation.
Right. And so remember that the states had assumed a lot of their own debt during the Revolutionary War era. In order to fund their entire Revolutionary War, they had to take out loans from other countries and other states, and they basically had to pay for all of their equipment, their weapons, their clothing. It's not cheap to go to war, and so you have to be able to establish a good credit rating so you can get money from other lenders, and other countries will give you credit and give you money. And at that point in time, there wasn't just one American credit score. We had 14, because you had the 13 different colonies that all had acquired their own loans and their own state debt. And then you had the centralized government that had taken on some of their own loans as well. And so Hamilton's plan is, why don't we assume all of the debt together so that we can increase the country's capital and credit by increasing the country's debt? And another thing they do in this particular setup for the cabinet battle number one is that they roll together a number of different issues that were kind of passed at different moments throughout the Congress. Yeah. And so this assumption plan of assuming the state's debts is one portion of Hamilton's big plan. He put that forward pretty early on. And in the context of history, Jefferson didn't really have a lot to say on that issue at the time. Once they introduced the idea of a national bank, Jefferson was up at arms. He thought, this is where Hamilton has gone too far. We are trying to take too much power into the hands of a central executive. This is not okay. I am stepping up to the plate and I am opposed to this thing. And so you'll see in this particular song that we're talking about the assumption of state debts, talking about establishing the national bank. And then at the end of the Jefferson line, we actually get a comment about the Whiskey Rebellion, but we'll talk about that then.
So this cabinet battle isn't based off of one particular meeting in history. It's kind of throwing a bunch of stuff together. Mm-hmm. So jumping into our song, there's actually a funny anachronism here. The fact that it's called a cabinet battle, like the cabinet's meeting, the term cabinet wouldn't actually be used to describe the Department of Secretaries who offered advice to the president until the Madison administration.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The presidential cabinet as we know it today is much bigger than it was then. And it was definitely not thought of as the presidential cabinet until that point in time. It was just kind of the Constitution had established the role of a Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, and a Secretary of War. And it also gave rise to the Office of Attorney General, but they didn't have an actual office they were running. They were just positioned there. And so that's kind of Washington's presidential cabinet. But you're right. We're trying to describe something in a way that it wouldn't have necessarily used that word at that period of time.
So, Robbie, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how Washington interacted with this cabinet?
Okay, yeah. So remember that Washington as a general in the Revolutionary War actually had this reputation for really listening to a lot of his generals. He loved to get insight from everyone around him. He didn't like to make unilateral decisions on his own. He actually had this reputation for indecision from crisis to crisis because he wasn't making one unilateral decision. He was waiting so that he could listen to every single voice, hear all the different ideas, and then pick which one he thought was best at the end. So he kind of takes that history of being the general who listened to all of his generals and all of his representatives underneath him. He takes this experience into his cabinet and the way he actually runs things. So Washington picks people to be a part of his cabinet, not because they're going to advance one particular agenda, which is what you would see in a contemporary presidential cabinet. You would see that he actually presents a lot of different perspectives. He says, I want someone from the South who is going to fight for this type of an idea. I want someone from the North who's going to fight for this type of an idea. And he basically puts these two political rivals against each other in the same cabinet to where his cabinet is going to fracture into factions, as we see later on, and it's going to be a very divisive situation. And yeah, in this particular battle, in this rap battle, we're going to see that Washington says, hey, you two, with very different ideals, very different ideas for how the country should be ran, I want you to present your ideas, Hamilton. I want you to present your ideas, Jefferson. Bring them to the table and let's discuss this and see what we can get to in the end.
Yeah, it's not like he didn't know where Jefferson stood and that Jefferson didn't even necessarily agree with him on everything. He knew that and he picked him purposely because of that.
Yep. So are you ready to dive right into this particular song?
Yeah. So speaking of the song itself and the music here, there's actually a bit of a callback in the music to 10 Duel Commandments, which is kind of interesting because it's bringing up the point. This is another type of duel. They may not be guns, but they're using words, which can be just as dangerous.
Yeah, and that's the type of duel that someone like Thomas Jefferson would definitely have preferred. He was not a soldier. He was the kind of guy that would like to write all of his things down and actually engage on that intellectual level. He's much more of a Ravenclaw in general.
So like I mentioned at the beginning, George Washington comes out and he's our MC here. He introduces the battle. And like I started the episode, he says, ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. And that's actually a reference to a Jay-Z song called Izzo, where he says a very similar thing. He says, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me.
Yeah, I like that. I think that it's also a nice little reference for the New York City Broadway audiences, to where they're like, hey, you are here with us right now in New York City. So it's just one more time when Lin-Manuel decided to pander to his audiences.
Right. The greatest city in the world.
Greatest city in the world.
And so like you even mentioned there, he's talking not only to the gathered quote unquote audience on the stage, you have the ensemble surrounding them kind of. He's talking to them, but he's also talking to the specific audience at the theater.
And his question for the audience there is, are you ready for a cabinet meeting? Which is just a great little aside, because you think cabinet meeting, you think boring, drawn out, you think high level, it's just not as fun. And you think all of this setup is
C-SPAN.
Probably... Right, C-SPAN.
Welcome to C-SPAN. We're going to have a rap battle. I would watch so much more C-SPAN if this is the way it was.
That would be great. Like a good master of ceremonies, Washington decides to lay down the terms of this debate in very clear terms. He says the issue on the table is this: Secretary Hamilton's plan to assume states' debts and establish a national bank. That's what they're here to debate today. That's what they came to the table, to the cabinet meeting to discuss, and that's what they're supposed to do. And he turns over control of the floor to Jefferson, lets him have the microphone, and says, "Sir, you have the floor."
And Lin-Manuel Miranda has an interesting comment on Jefferson's role here. He says, putting this cabinet meeting into the world of battle rapping makes it visceral. Like, you see Jefferson do a pretty generic battle. He's like, this is why your plan is BS, and I don't even know you. He's like the prize fighter who doesn't even think he has to train for a fight. He comes in and is like, remember that Declaration of Independence? Yeah, I wrote that. Anyway, did you read this thing? It's too long.
That's awesome. That also makes sense from the last song, because Jefferson's kind of debonair attitude when he strolled into Monticello the other day, he said, I have my first cabinet meeting today. I guess I better think of something to say.
Right.
Because he hadn't really put that practice into this. He was not prepared for the force that is Hamilton that was coming at him like a storm.
So Jefferson jumps in, and with his sing-songy version of rapping that he does here at the beginning, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals. We shouldn't settle for less. These are wise words, and the prizing men quote them. Don't act surprised, you guys, because I wrote them. Which, I mean, it is true. He did have a big hand in the Declaration of Independence, where that is from, but that's not the first place that idea has come from, or those words even. He actually was probably inspired by John Locke to put that in the Declaration of Independence.
Right, but John Locke's version, didn't it say something like life, liberty, and the pursuit of property?
Yeah, it said the state.
Okay, gotcha. There's a lot of plagiarism in a lot of his
writings. It's not necessarily, he acts like, oh, this is my thing, I wrote this. And, well, you were inspired. Okay.
Right. I always imagine this hoity-toity, like a finger in the air, wagging like a professorial role where he's saying, these are wise words, enterprising men quote them. And then he breaks down like, don't act surprised, you guys. I wrote them. I got this, guys.
And I love the internal rhymes there. The wise, enterprise, surprise, guys.
Yeah, those are so clever. That's one example of where Jefferson's rapping and his rhyming is lazier, perhaps, but no less sophisticated than Hamilton's.
Right.
And to keep the spirit of a battle rap alive, he turns directly to his opponent and he says, but Hamilton forgets these principles I've been talking about. Hamilton forgets the Declaration of Independence and how important that was. He turns his plan directly towards him, trying to paint his enemy as if he's an anti-American person.
Jefferson thinks that Hamilton's ideas come from principles adverse to liberty.
Which is a little unfair, perhaps, but that is how politics gets done, even today sometimes. You don't often tell your enemy that I think you made a good point there, Hamilton, or I think you made a great point, Jefferson. You often demonize your enemies in order to make them look like terrible people so that no one wants to be swayed by their positions. And so that's not how real good discourse should happen. That's not how friendly communication should happen. That's not how civil discourse should be done. But that's how it often gets done, especially in the day of Hamilton and Jefferson debates.
Right. So Jefferson goes on to say, now place your bets as to who that benefits, the very seat of government where Hamilton sits. So he's kind of accusing Hamilton of being self-serving here, saying that Hamilton just wants more power to the treasury, basically. And these aren't the last claims of corruption that will be laid against Hamilton throughout his life.
Yeah, we'll definitely see a lot more of that in this particular musical when Jefferson, Madison, and Burr get together and they say the evidence is pointing towards you engaging in speculation, an immigrant embezzling government funds. And so this is a really sore spot for Hamilton, both in the musical and in the historical accounts, because he always wanted to be above public reproach. He wanted to be someone who could be seen as honest with the money that was entrusted to him. He didn't want to give in to the attacks that he was a man who lacked integrity in his political post.
Yeah, and that's why you have this outburst from Hamilton in the middle of it. Not true.
Yeah, I love that like immature little interjection where he's like, not true, guys. He's not waiting for his turn to rap. He's just interjecting because it's so close to home for Hamilton that he is not going to let a personal attack of lacking integrity slide like that. Later on in the musical, he's going to write an entire self-deprecating pamphlet where he confesses to an extramarital affair just so that he can avoid the attack of being dishonest with public money.
Yeah, so Jefferson shoots back, if the shoe fits, wear it. And keep that in mind because that's going to come up again when Hamilton's turn comes around.
Yeah, when he turns that rap around.
So Jefferson says, our debts are paid, which is partially true. States like Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia had paid off their debts after the war, partially due to levying high taxes. But the divide wasn't completely north and south. South Carolina was deeply in debt, and Pennsylvania was doing actually pretty good.
So here we see this particular expression of Jefferson's love for states' rights and states' independence, where he basically is saying that, look, if New York needs to deal with their finances, fine, go ahead and deal with those. But Virginia is going to deal with our finances in our own particular way, and we're not all in this together. This is not a High School Musical moment where they all have this montage and get onto the same page and they're supporting each other. This is the moment where he's basically saying, like, I'm not here for you. You're not here for me. I'm here to maximize independence because we're all supposed to be free people and free states, and our job as the federal government is not to take those rights away from the states because, as Jefferson is known to support, the government that's closer to the people in his mind is the one that is best. And so in the lyrics here, he actually goes on to say, don't tax the South because we got a made in the shade. And like you were talking about, Vinton, it isn't specifically a North-South divide. It's every state for themselves. But he basically says, in Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. Like, we have our own way of doing things down there. Don't try to interfere with that, guys. That's not what the job of the federal government is, in his opinion.
Yeah, Jefferson strongly espoused that farmers were the source and guardians of America's liberty. He actually wrote, cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. They are the most vigorous and most independent, the most virtuous, and they are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty and interests by the most lasting bands. Of course, Hamilton's going to completely destroy this argument in a second by saying, you're not the one doing the planting, man. But we'll get to that.
Right. So Jefferson definitely takes ownership of being a farmer, even though you're right, he's not the one that's actually pulling the plow or working the fields. But he does come up with these like brilliant ways. Like, he had a 7-year crop rotation, I believe. He had these ideas of how to be a good farmer. He was pretty in league with Washington as far as wanting to be a progressive farmer and wanting to advance those rights. But one of the areas where he disagreed with Washington's philosophies a lot is that Washington often also supported the Federalists' plan to be a lot more involved in manufacturing and industry work rather than just being an agrarian, farmer-led society like Jefferson wanted it to be. The bread and butter of American economics was, for Jefferson, farming, and he thought that that was where we were going to end.
Yeah, and he kind of got that from early French economists, that agriculture is the source of all wealth. And while he may have loved farmers, Jefferson hated banks, which I guess if you're usually in as much debt as Jefferson is, you'd hate banks too.
Probably.
He actually wrote about banks and said, and I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity under a large scale, basically stealing from the future.
So Jefferson was opposed to the idea of a standing army and to the idea of a bank and all of these things that he thought increased the size of the central government that he thought were really unnecessary, and he thought that they were moves towards monarchical societies that looked a lot like the way a king would run their country rather than an actual republic would be ran.
And that's a good point, because later Jefferson's actually going to accuse Hamilton of being a monarchist because he thinks that those ideas will lead to that.
Right. And so remember during the Constitutional Convention, there was this gag order that said all of the ideas that are issued here are going to be private because we want to come out with one constitution that needs to be supported by all of us. And so you can present your ideas here, no ridicule, no chance of shame. But there were people who kept private notes. And so in that long speech that Hamilton gave, he did issue this idea of a lifelong executive who looked a lot like a monarch. And some people had taken notes in that meeting, and they held on to those notes until later in Hamilton's life. And they broke that oath that they had made to keep things quiet. by bringing up those things that Hamilton had said in the confidence of this assembly, and they just repeated those accusations over and over and over again. So ignore the fact that Hamilton had been a huge defender of the Constitution. Ignore the fact that he had been a huge proponent of the legislative branch and how the government's branches should work together. Jefferson just kept repeating and repeating this attack of monarchicalism to the point that it basically proved the rule of thumb that if you repeat a story often enough, it doesn't matter how true it is, it will eventually sink into the minds of the audience. It'll start to sink into the minds of the people around you. You may even start to believe your own lies so that you can't think about what was true, what wasn't true. And Jefferson just constantly repeats this attack of Hamilton being a monarch who wants to establish this bank as a stepping stone to establishing a king of America.
So then in the lyrics, he goes on to say, this thing that Hamilton wrote, this thing he's proposing, it's too many pages for anyone to understand. Which, historically, Hamilton's first report on the public credit was 40,000 words, and his second one was 15,000. So he's not entirely wrong, probably.
Right.
It's probably a lot there.
Now, that particular report on public debt was not something that was supposed to be passed around like as a pamphlet for every single person to read necessarily. It was a report to Congress that wanted to see what is the state of affairs for public finances in the United States? What do we have? And so, yeah, he did a very detailed job going into all of those things. But much like our legislators today, they often talk about the plans without even having read the plans.
Right. And speaking of politicians today, this is actually echoing comments that have been made about the Obama administration's Affordable Care Act, saying that it's too long to understand or vote upon.
Right, and I really think that that's helpful in this particular framing of the cabinet battle, because you'll see that a lot of the things that are said in accusations against the other side are often actually mimicked throughout American politics, where we talk about how we demonize our enemies, we talk about how this is just too many pages for anyone to have time to deal with, and then there are also all those comments about life and liberty and how our opponents are just people who are taking those down. So Jefferson uses all of these techniques, and he ends with a rousing reference and allusion to the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, and he says that you should stand with me in the land of the free.
Which is, of course, anachronistically quoting the Star-Spangled Banner, which is based off a poem by Francis Scott Key, who, like Jefferson, was kind of an unrepentant slaveholder talking about the land of the free, in a land where 17% of the people are slaves and only 10% of the people can vote. Yeah, land of the free.
Right. It's definitely another example of that type of contradiction that we see in Jefferson's lifestyle that we were talking about in our last episode dedicated to Thomas Jefferson.
Then Jefferson says, pray that we don't see a Hamilton candidacy, which Alexander Hamilton could have become president according to the Constitution, while today it says that you have to be born here to become the president. Back then it said, or be a citizen at the time that the Constitution was adopted.
Yeah, so today you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States of America in order to serve as the president of the United States of America. But you're right, since Hamilton was a resident of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, he was kind of grandfathered in to be eligible for candidacy, and that was always on the table as far as the Democratic Republicans fearing that he might actually run because he was a force unto himself, a colossus who was going to basically be looming over all of American politics for a while, until you get to the Reynolds pamphlet, when you hear people like Jefferson and Madison saying he's never going to be president now because he has ruined his prospects. All that's off the table now. And so here you see Jefferson at the very beginning saying, hey, we really don't want him to be a president.
And then he continues on saying, look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's going to happen when you try to tax our whiskey. Robbie, why don't you tell us what does happen when Hamilton does tax their whiskey?
So, yeah, the whole whiskey rebellion, we don't have enough time to dedicate a whole episode to this, but I almost wish we did.
And surprisingly enough, there was a whole song almost dedicated to this in the musical.
Oh, really?
Originally, the song One Last Time was called One Last Ride, and the whole first half of it was about the whiskey rebellion.
Oh my goodness. I would have loved to hear that, because that is such a fascinating moment in American history. So basically, the idea was that Hamilton needed to raise some revenue for funding the government, because in order to start paying off the debt that you assume, you need to actually have some money on hand. And so one of the ways that he proposed to do this, because the tariffs were already pretty strong on imported goods, and he couldn't necessarily promote an obligatory tax on everyone in the United States without causing massive riots. And another idea that was floated was the idea of a land tax, but that wouldn't necessarily fly with President Washington, who was trying to sell hundreds of acres of his own land out west. And so it was not something that could necessarily pass in this particular environment. Hamilton went to one of the last resorts that he had to raise taxes and raise money, and he decided to implement this excise tax on whiskey inside of the United States.
So, Robbie, exactly how popular was this whiskey tax? Sounds like something everyone would celebrate.
Yeah, no, not everyone is celebrating this. There were some pretty big opponents to this plan. Although, famously, actually, James Madison was not opposed to the plan. So
really?
In this particular context, like we said, this rap battle is combining the assumption of state debts, the establishment of a bank, and the whiskey tax into one particular issue, and is presenting Madison and Jefferson as one united front against all of Hamilton's ideas. But really, Madison actually supported the excise tax on spirits and on whiskey because he said that it would actually have some collateral social benefits. Like, he said that it would actually increase sobriety and thereby prevent disease and untimely deaths. So it's like a social benefit to everyone. And he also talked about how there weren't very many alternatives on the table there. He said, as direct taxes would still be generally obnoxious and imports are already loaded as far as they will bear, an excise is the only resource, and of all articles, distilled spirits are the least objectionable. So Madison was actually saying that, I'm not in favor of a lot of your policies, Hamilton, but you know what? This whiskey tax, that's fine. Whatever. I'm not going to oppose it outright at the beginning, at least.
Right. And Hamilton wasn't necessarily wrong about this. He thought that people were consuming too much alcohol as well. And people kind of were. I mean, there was a lot of alcohol being consumed because it was a lot safer to drink than the germ-laden polluted water that they had at the time. I mean, look at it from today's stance. On average today, people drink about 2.3 gallons of alcohol a year. Back then, that average was just under 6 gallons. It was almost 3 times as much back then.
Wow, that's crazy to think about.
Yeah, so the taxes on that would be a lot.
True. Now, the problem here, the catch, is that this particular tax didn't just hit people who were actually drinking a lot of alcohol. It actually hit people who were producing a lot of alcohol.
Right.
So the farmers themselves who were growing crops that would eventually be turned into moonshine and whiskey in these areas that actually relied on economically the benefits of whiskey, those areas, the farmers impacted, would actually be hurt, and it would be a detrimental thing for their economies. And the way that the whiskey tax was actually implemented was disproportionately hurting the smaller farmers over the larger farmers, because basically the way they implemented this tax was not incredibly well thought out. It was as good as they could have gotten at the time in a lot of ways, but they did implement it in a way that said you can either pay a flat amount that says this is how much you're paying to the government in order to produce whiskey, or you could pay per gallon that would basically tax your particular quantities. So if you had a smaller amount of alcohol to actually produce, you could just pay per amount, per gallon that you would be paying. The problem is this benefits the really big distilleries in the East. So the big businesses are able to just play that flat rate, and then they can make whatever profit they would make on top of everything to begin with. The farmers couldn't just pay that flat rate because it's above what their profit margin was to begin with. So they had to pay the per gallon amount, and it often cut into their actual profits for their goods. And when you consider the fact that some of the Western territories would make a lot of this whiskey, then they would have to transport it across the mountain ranges and across into the areas where the Eastern markets would actually trade them and sell them. That made it to where the transportation cost alone was almost not worth what it took to actually pay these taxes. So a lot of people got really upset. A lot of farmers refused to pay, and a lot of areas actually rallied around the idea of refusing to pay the whiskey tax.
And it actually got a lot worse than that.
Yeah, more than just refusing to pay taxes. People in Western Pennsylvania actually got together and tarred and feathered the tax collectors.
Yeah.
So that's just a bizarre punishment, if you ask me. Like, I've always heard about tarring and feathering people.
Right.
Who thought of that?
Yeah.
Who decided to just pour hot tar on someone and then throw feathers on them to make them walk through the streets like a chicken? I don't know what it is. What's the point of that? Someone tell me. But anyways, so they were attacking tax collectors, and they actually had gotten to the point where after this long period of time, not a single cent from the whiskey tax had been collected in Western Pennsylvania. Washington got a little upset. He was upset that there were a lot of militant groups that were rising up. He actually, in one of his State of the Union addresses, blamed Democratic Republican societies and Democratic Republican press and Democratic Republican rhetoric for actually allowing these types of uprisings to happen. And he essentially went over there and he said, this is not going to happen anymore. Hamilton and Washington said this amounts to treason when you are actively arming yourselves and you're acting like a militia of your own accord, and you are attacking government representatives who are coming here to enforce a legal tax that was set on the people. So trying to make a long story a little bit shorter for this particular episode, you essentially see that Washington rallies together nearly 13,000 soldiers and leads them into war against this band of militants in Western Pennsylvania who have basically decided that they're going to take up arms and resist the tax collectors because they thought this was an unjust tax, an unfair tax that was disproportionately hurting the farmers and this one demographic of people, specifically the weaker farmers, the smaller farmers. And they thought this is unfair. This is not what our government was established to be. So they thought more than just voting for our representatives, we are going to stand up to our representatives by militantly gathering and refusing to adhere to what we consider unjust laws. So Washington disagrees with that, rallies all of those soldiers together, marches there, and because he wants to not actually sully his own reputation by killing American citizens as a president, he did kind of, at a certain point, leave the military to the hands of the other people that were taking in charge. At that point, the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, was not available, so Hamilton was one of the leaders that was marching forward with the militants who were going into the region. They didn't actually kill many at that point. The struggle, they didn't actually resist this huge, massive force being led by the American government. But this period in history is known as the only time that a sitting president actually led forces into battle, specifically. Other presidents have been militant leaders, military generals, but they haven't been sitting and then they go to the front line to lead the military, especially against specific American citizens. And so it was a really complicated time. But Hamilton and his colleagues with the United States government are basically able to rally together about a couple dozen people that they essentially indict as war criminals and people who are tried for treason. Only 2 of them ended up actually getting charges to stick against them in a court. And then Washington eventually pardoned those 2 people, saying, you know what, we're not going to hold you accountable for those types of things. You just need to know that we are the federal government and we get to say what is right. You don't get to stand up against us. So the fallout of the Whiskey Rebellion is less about a particular tax itself, less about whether you can tax specific goods or services or one type of section of the economy. It's more about, does the federal government get that trump power over people's rights? Or do the people have the final say over what the federal government can do? And so Jefferson here is talking about how if the federal government gets bigger, if the federal government grows in power, if you allow the federal government to start taxing all these different things, you're taking away the people's rights. And imagine what will happen when you try to tax their whiskey. Well, they're going to get angry. They're going to riot. They're going to organize, and they are going to eventually oppose the federal government. And it does get shut down by Washington and Hamilton and the rest of the staff there. But it kind of changes the discourse of American politics for at least a few presidencies, where you see that the presidency now has this very strong federal power, like Hamilton has been pushing it to have, and Jefferson has to kind of relent on some of the centralized powers that he did not want to see happen. He sees that now that has happened.
So this Whiskey Rebellion that started in 1791 will come to an end in 1794. And the Democratic Republicans will actually be able to repeal this tax eventually in 1801.
Under the Thomas Jefferson presidency, right?
I believe so, yeah.
So that brings us to the end of Jefferson's actual attacks on Hamilton's plans. Washington steps up to the plate. He says, Thank you, Secretary Jefferson. Secretary Hamilton, your response. So he's passing the mic over, and now we're going to see that the guy who created these plans is actually going to step up to the plate, and we're going to see Hamilton in the zone, going at it against his political rival. He finally realizes that Jefferson is an opponent, a force to be reckoned with, and he is ready to unleash his word storm against Mr. Jefferson.
Right. Hamilton comes right in with his passion and his fervor. Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the present. We're running a real nation. Which, I mean, he's right off the bat, he's saying, hey, quoting the Declaration of Independence, yeah, you wrote that. That was 10 years ago, buddy. Get out of the past. We're doing a new thing here.
Welcome to the present.
Welcome to the present.
Oh, that's so good. I love that. And it's definitely a little criticism like, hey, all those things you said, so what? Let's get on with this. This is a real nation we're running. Are you willing to actually step up to the challenge, or are you just going to stay down there in Monticello doing whatever the hell it is you do there?
And we kind of mentioned last time on the podcast what he does down there and all the craziness that goes on.
Right, exactly. So he's got his attacks of Jefferson out of the way. First thing, he's going to bring up a couple more of those in a moment, though.
Yeah, and you see there that he says, staying mellow, and later he'll say, getting high with the French. And there's some insinuation that Jefferson was a partaker in smoking hemp.
Yeah, and I've heard some of those insinuations. It's interesting to think about. We don't know historically anything along those lines, but it does certainly have that particular connotation and allusion inside the context of this song.
So Hamilton is going to explain his side here. If we assume the debts, the Union gets a new line of credit, a financial diuretic. How do you not get it? If we're aggressive and competitive, the Union gets a boost. You'd rather give it a sedative? So he's basically saying that his plan here is going to help cash flow. It's going to, he hopes, bind the states together and solidify them with a shared identity, a shared debt.
Yeah, and I think this is a really easy way to understand the basics of what his financial plan is essentially talking about when he talks about assuming debts. He's saying that if you assume the debt, you basically are going to have a new credit rating. You're going to have a new line of credit where people are going to actually loan money to you because you're actually making payments on your debt. You're actually assuming the responsibility for all of these loans that have already been paid. So you're going to get the economy going, the financial diuretic, so to speak, which is kind of a gross image, but it makes sense. And it goes with the parallel image of stopping the flow of the financial sector by calling it a sedative. And before we started recording this episode, I grabbed the Hamiltome and I was looking at the annotated lyrics where Lin-Manuel was discussing this word diuretic. And he says, the first thing I did here was to look up the etymology of diuretic and make sure that it existed in this era as far as that word goes. It's funny to talk about that. Talking about the Hamiltome, we still have another week in our competition. If you want to actually enter to win a new copy of Hamilton the Revolution by Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jeremy McCarter, we want to send you a free copy. So get on Twitter. We have a pinned tweet at the Graphomania Twitter page. If you go to @GraphoCast, you can see the pinned tweet there. Follow us and retweet it in order to actually enter the competition, and we will let you know who wins.
Right. We're going to randomly select one of the people who follows and retweets, and we're going to announce the winner on our show on May 17th.
That's right.
Shameless Twitter plugs aside, jumping back into what we were talking about here. So the National Bank, which was supported by Hamilton, which would come to be, would then expire under the presidency of Madison until, of course, the War of 1812, when he realized he couldn't pay for the war. And he started thinking, oh, maybe that Hamilton guy had some good ideas.
Right. That's definitely an interesting legacy that Hamilton has, that during the long string of Republican presidents, a lot of them tried to take down a lot of Hamilton's policies and his bank and a lot of the things he set into motion. And a lot of them failed to be able to change any of those things. And they had to eventually acknowledge, like you'll see at the very end of this musical after Hamilton dies, that a lot of Washington's successors in the presidency eventually just kind of have to look at Hamilton's legacy and say, you know what? He did this thing. There's one thing I'll give him, that he doesn't get enough credit for all the credit he gave us, as Jefferson would eventually say that.
So Hamilton's going to come in with this powerful line here. Civics lessons from a slaver, which, as we know, Hamilton was an abolitionist, and Jefferson was not really.
Right. And so it's interesting to look at the historical evidence for Hamilton as an abolitionist, because I've seen in Ron Chernow, he makes this huge, really good defense of how much of an abolitionist Alexander Hamilton was. A lot of other writers and biographers look at Hamilton, and there are two moments in his life when he actually did kind of purchase slaves. And so, like, as a child in the Caribbean, his mother inherited slaves in a will, and then they kind of loaned them out to other people to make some family income. And then later, as an adult, he actually purchased slaves twice, but both times they were for his brother-in-law, John Church. And he made that very clear in his writing, saying, I'm not here actually buying these people. I don't want to do this. I don't support this. He didn't have household slaves himself, but he purchased these on behalf of John Church when he and Angelica were coming back to the States, and they were like, hey, we're going to need some help around the house, around the area. Will you get things in order for us? And so there's a lot of things to discuss about Hamilton and abolition that we'll probably bring into some future podcasts as well. But he is, in this musical and historically, very much opposed to slavery. And this is one of those areas where he's going to attack Jefferson, saying, look, you are a hypocrite. You are talking about independence, and you're a slaver. You're talking about how you plant so many good things, and yet you're not actually planting anything. You're letting your slaves do all the planting.
Yeah, he's calling them out here, saying, hey, neighbor, your debts are paid because you don't pay for labor. We plant seeds in the South we create. Yeah, keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting. And Lin-Manuel Miranda actually said that he liked this line because it kind of feels like getting to go back in time and telling Jefferson off, saying, hey, man, this is what we think of you even from now. And it's like,
it's a cathartic release.
Yeah, exactly. David Diggs, who plays Jefferson in Lafayette, said that these lines were actually what remains from a few songs that were all about slavery that got cut from the show eventually.
Man, all these talks about things that were cut from the show and all these things that were not able to make the final cut for the length of time and all the themes in general really makes me wish that we could have like a Lord of the Rings extended edition
Right.
version of this, where you have like a 10-hour long Hamilton special.
Oh man.
I would totally binge watch that in one sitting.
Yeah, we'll probably have to start covering some more of these apocryphal songs and things as we go on, because it's really interesting. And the more we look into it, the more we want to talk about those things as well.
Yeah, we really do.
I like that Hamilton calls him Mr. Age of Enlightenment, because, I mean, the Age of Enlightenment is where Jefferson gets a lot of his ideas. John Locke, obviously, is one of those people that he took a lot from, who was from the Age of Enlightenment. And it's also kind of a slap in the face. Age of Enlightenment, quote unquote. Hamilton actually wrote a letter to Jefferson and Madison at some point, and he said specifically, who talks most about liberty and equality? Is it not those who hold the Bill of Rights in one hand and the whip for affrighted slaves in the other?
Oh, that is a burn if ever I've heard one.
I had to tweet that earlier just because it was so good. I was like, oh, I know we just released last week's episode, but I got to tweet this right now.
Right. It's so good. And from there, Hamilton turns his attention to one of the first arguments that Thomas Jefferson actually made when he made his opening remarks. He said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals. We shouldn't settle for less. Jefferson wasn't a soldier. Hamilton was.
Right.
Hamilton looks at him and he says, and another thing, Mr. Age of Enlightenment, don't lecture me about the war.
You didn't fight in it.
And he goes on to talk about how, like, I almost died in a trench while you were off getting high with the French. You think I'm going to be frightened of you? You think I'm going to be fighting to the things you're bringing to the table?
Right.
I had to face a real war, and you're just stepping up to the plate right now. It's ridiculous.
Right. And as we mentioned last week, Jefferson was governor in Virginia during the war partially, but he never saw battle there. He actually was retreating from Monticello while Hamilton, Lafayette, and Washington were planning their advance on Yorktown.
That's right. So after making these very personal attacks at Thomas Jefferson, he kind of turns to the rest of the crowd a little bit. You imagine him saying, Thomas Jefferson, always hesitant with the president, reticent. There isn't a plan he doesn't jettison.
Right. I love that rhyme as he keeps going. Jefferson, hesitant, president, reticent. There isn't jettison, Madison, Henderson, medicine, dedizen. I love that just rhyming going through
so
it.
great.
It's
I
so
love that.
Good. And no wonder the beat just drops there. The record scratches and it's done. And this is the moment where Hamilton, as we know he is apt to do, begins to run off at the mouth a little bit.
Yeah. So in another reference in the Hamiltone, Lin-Manuel basically talks about how there are two basic reactions people have whenever conflict comes up. You can either get really stressed out and too angry that you kind of lose your words and you're too flustered to talk. He calls it running hot, where you're just so overwhelmed in that. And he says, you can run cold like Hamilton, where everything just kind of slows down and you get all of the right words in just that moment. And Hamilton is this kind of guy that he has all of these words and he's absolutely going to throw them at you, hit you in the face with all of the things he has to say, because he isn't going to be so flustered that he can't say anything. He opens his mouth and gives ammunition to his enemies by constantly running his mouth.
And he mentions here that Madison's mad as a hatter and he needs to take his medicine. Historically, Madison did have panic attacks and may even have had epilepsy, which had a big stigma back then. And people thought that people with epilepsy were crazy or maybe even possessed back then. He also dealt with hypochondria. So he had a lot going on. And that's what Hamilton here is attacking.
Yeah, I think that this is a neat moment to talk about how in the intermission episode, when we talked about the deleted scene with John Lawrence passing away, we saw that Hamilton was deprived of a lifelong ally that would have helped him alongside his Washington administration, could have actually helped him advance some of these arguments. Jefferson had those lifelong allies. He had people like James Madison sitting beside him promoting these things. Hamilton is kind of a force of his own.
Right, keeping the terms of a rap battle here. Jefferson's running with a crew. He's got Madison and he's got Burr backing up. At least he will eventually. And Hamilton, maybe he has Washington, but Washington has to stay a little bit impartial, being the president. And Hamilton no longer has the three friends he had in Act 1 to back him up. He doesn't have a running crew anymore. Yeah,
it's true. And you almost have to wonder if some of his aggression at turning towards Madison in this moment is almost coming from that sense of loneliness and betrayal, feeling attacked, but then, also feeling betrayed because Madison used to be his friend. He used to be the one that was his ally who was actually helping him support the Constitution, helping him defend the Federalist side in the Constitution debate. And so, he's here. He's alone. He has to attack all of these forces that are against him at once. He's probably said a few things more than he should have, kind of got a little ahead of himself, attacking too many things. But he does draw this back in to the end when he says, you're in worse shape than the national debt is in.
Exactly.
So he's talking about, like, he's been rapping about the national debt. He says, you know what, you're actually worse off than it. So maybe we should give you some attention. Take your medicine, Madison.
At which point he brings up that line I mentioned earlier that you should keep in mind, where Jefferson said, if the shoe fits, and he says, hey, turn around, I'll show you where my shoe fits.
Oh,
which, I love that line.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
Which is the line where Washington jumps in. Excuse me? Madison, Jefferson, take a walk. Hamilton, take a walk. We'll reconvene. And then he gets this parental sounding tone to him when he talks to Hamilton. He kind of sends Jefferson and Madison off, but he has this parental feeling toward Hamilton, as we've mentioned before, and he kind of talks to him like a disappointed parent.
Yeah, I remember fighting with my siblings growing up a little bit, and as soon as the parents walk in, they're like, excuse me? Usually that kind of, that puts a tone of finality to it all, where you are done. You can't keep going after daddy comes in with his belt off, and he's ready to have a word with Hamilton on his own. So he calls him over to the side, and as Washington walks over, Hamilton is about to join Washington, but first he's stopped by Madison and Jefferson, who confront him and say things like, hey, you don't have the votes. They start teasing him.
Yeah.
They're actively teaming up on him. They're taking their crew together and they're bullying him a little bit. You don't have the votes. And they start just laughing at him.
Right. Madison held significant influence over the Congress, so it was going to be hard for him to get the votes for his bill, and they knew that, so they were making fun of him here for it. And the way they do it, with Jefferson saying that, ha, 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 and then saying such a blunder sometimes, it makes me wonder. It's actually an allusion to the Grandmaster Flash song, The Message, where he says, it's a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Ha, ha, ha.
Yes, it's so good. You had to actually play that song for me before the podcast so that I could remember it. I knew it, but yeah.
Such a good one.
It is a good one.
So Hamilton and Washington get into a little bit of an argument here.
Yeah, and Washington says, hey, you want to pull yourself together? You got a little out of hand over there, dude. Like, too far, too far.
To which Hamilton's like, these Virginians are like birds of a feather. And Washington's like, hey, I'm from Virginia, man.
Watch your mouth. I do like this. This kind of reminds me of the scene where after the first duel, when they had the 10 duel commandments, you see, meet me inside. And so Hamilton is here with his commanding officer now. You see that Washington is no longer acting like that detached person who's just an impartial MC. He is acting now as the commanding officer, looking to Hamilton, his right-hand man, saying, you need to pull yourself together. You need to get the votes so that you can pass your plan.
Right. And Hamilton mentions Madison won't talk to me. Their friendship's over. They're on opposite sides now. And Washington brings up this point, which is an allusion to a point you made earlier. Winning was easy, young man. Governing is harder.
Yeah, so in the first act confrontation, Hamilton is up at arms, wanting to be a war hero, and Hamilton gets shut down by Washington when he says, dying is easy, young man. Living is harder. So don't try to die on the battlefield in glory. Make sure you actually live for something. Here, he's saying, we won the war, you won your position, you earned up to this reputation that you have. Now you need to actually start doing something, governing, make these things happen.
He tells him, you need to find compromise, which he will. It'll be called the dinner table bargain, the compromise of 1790. And that's going to happen in the room where it happens. We'll get there. But here, Hamilton's just stressed out. He's like, what if I don't get congressional approval? And he's like, they're going to recall for your removal. He's like, sir, figure it out, Alexander. That is an order from your commander. We see that same line again that we got at the end of Meet Me Inside.
That's right. So the commanding officer is actively fulfilling that role that Alexander's so used to him fulfilling as the leader of the army, the leader of America now. He is just going to tell Alexander, look, we have enough of a rapport that I'm just going to tell you, get this done. It doesn't matter if they're being intransigent. It doesn't matter if they're not actually putting forward a plan on their own. You need to actually make sure this happens. It's your job on the line, which is a lot of pressure. And that pressure is what will bring Hamilton to the tipping point in the next couple of songs.
Which are Take a Break and Say No to This. And we'll be covering those in our next episode.
That's right. So tune in next week to another episode of Hamilton the Podcast, and we will see Hamilton on edge, stressing out about losing his job, and we will see the really big error of judgment that he decides to make.
So as we mentioned before in the episode, remember that we're giving away one of these Hamiltons, the Hamilton, the Revolution book. All you got to do is get on our Twitter, which is @GraphoCast, and find that pinned tweet we have at the top of our profile, follow us and retweet that, and you'll be entered to win. We're going to randomly draw and announce the winner on May 17th, during our episode.
So if you're interested in learning more about the Hamilton-Jefferson feud and some of their particular debates, and really a lot of their entire lives, I have a book that I really do recommend very highly. It's John Ferling's book, Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation. So if the Alexander Hamilton biography by Ron Chernow is a little bit daunting to you because of how thick it is, this book is less thick, and it's actually a biography that covers both the life of Jefferson and the life of Hamilton. There's a lot of overlap with Chernow's book and this book, but it specifically covers a lot of their coming of age and their rise to power, and it's going to outline these positions that we've been discussing throughout this particular episode, and it really does a good job of giving a fair treatment to both of these founding fathers.
So if you want to pick up this book, we'll have a link to it in our show notes, and that's actually an Amazon affiliate link. So if you click that link and purchase it through there, we'll get a few cents off of that purchase. It won't cost you any extra, but it'll help out our podcast a little bit.
That's right.
And speaking of helping out our podcast, we still have our Patreon going on. So if you go to patreon.com/Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST, you can contribute toward our podcast network. For as little as $1 a month, you'll have access to all the exclusive features that we post up there. And there are other tiers that you can contribute, including the $10 Founding Father Hamilton tier, where we'll be doing a recording specifically for you that we'll announce in the future.
And if you want to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at contact@graphocast.com or reach out to us on our personal Twitters. I'm @AlphaKnight.
And I'm @FleshEater.
So thanks for listening to this episode. Until next time, I am Robbie Herlocker.
And I'm Vinton Bain. Hi, Vinton Bain here again for a real quick announcement. The Graphomania Podcast Network has a new podcast, Read Brave Comics, a comics podcast where your hosts, Corey Casto and I, will introduce you to a wide variety of segments about the world of comic books, some of which will include segments by me and Robbie from this very Hamilton podcast. Check it out now on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or at graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. That's Read Brave Comics.